The first time I saw her, the wind was pushing hard from the north, carrying the dry bite of winter over the ridge. She stood against a weathered cedar post, wrists tied high, ankles bound, her dark hair snapping in the cold air. Wolves moved low through the sage, their gray backs blending into the ground as they circled in, closing the gap with every pass. I was close enough to hear their paws in the dirt when the wind dropped close enough to see her shoulders pulled tight with each breath. 100 yards more, and I'd have been too late. I shifted the Winchester in my hand, knowing one choice here would decide whether she saw another sunrise. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to choose in one moment between walking away or stepping in. My name's Luke Harland. I was born along the banks of the Platte, where the land rolls wide and the sky feels like it could drop right on your head. My folks raised me on a patch of prairie ground. They worked with their own hands, sun up to sundown, winter or summer. Sunday mornings kept for worship, and Sunday evenings for quiet talk by lamplight. We didn't have much beyond what the soil gave, but we had enough, and what we didn't use we shared with neighbors. Out there, a man's word and his back strength were the only things worth carrying, and my father taught me to keep both in good repair. By my early 20s, the railroad had chewed deep into the frontier, and with it came speculators, men with clean boots and quick hands for land papers, ready to strip a family out of their homestead for the promise of $1. I scouted for the cavalry for a spell, riding ahead through canyons and dry washes, finding water holes when the heat pressed hard and passes when the snow came early. It paid, but it left me with a mind full of what men will do when no one's watching. After the war, I came back to bury my wife, sold off the little plot we'd tended, and took to drifting with only a horse, a rifle, and the habit of keeping to myself. These past years, I've stayed mostly in the Badlands, or the high country far from the towns, where voices carry faster than the truth. Still, the quiet never lasts. A man learns to hear when trouble's blowing in the wrong set of tracks near his camp, the hush that falls over a canyon when something's moving close, or the sharp overlap of wolf howls when they've found something they mean to keep. That day, the sound carried to me across the low washes, thin but layered, drawing me north without a thought for where I'd meant to bed down. I didn't know then who she was or why she'd been left for the wolves. I only knew the ground between us was frozen hard, the sun already bleeding out of the sky, and that someone had put her there to die. I tightened my grip on the reins, the smell of dust and cold fur edging in on the wind, and nudged my horse toward the ridge, not yet seeing the eyes in the brush that were watching me back. The first shot kicked dust just in front of the lead wolf, making the whole pack freeze for a heartbeat before they broke apart into the brush. I levered the Winchester again, sending a second round over the back of another that lingered too close. Their shadows slipped low into the sage until the wind carried them off. The ridge was quiet now, except for the sound of my boots on frozen soil as I closed the distance to the cedar post. She watched me with eyes that measured every move, unsure whether I was better than the one who left her there. I slung the rifle over my shoulder and pulled the knife from my belt. The rope at her wrists was stiff with cold, and grit biting into her skin so deep the lines were already red and swelling. When it gave, her arms dropped hard and she nearly went with them. I caught her under the waist until she found her footing again. She pulled away as soon as she could stand on her own. I crouched to cut the binding at her ankles, then stepped back to give her room, pulling my canteen from the saddle and holding it out. She hesitated, but drank water running down her chin before she could catch it. The coat I laid across her shoulders was worn from years of use, one pocket sewn shut with twine, but it was warm enough for the bite in the air. The wolves were still out there, keeping a wider circle now. I helped her into the saddle, swung up behind, and kept my arm firm across her to steady her on the uneven ground. We didn't speak as we left the ridge, only the creak of leather and the wind pressing through the sage marking our pace. Each mile we put between us and that post loosened the shallow edge of her breathing. but I could feel the question in her, still who I was and what I meant to do with her. The trail dipped into a narrow wash, cutting the wind as we made the last turn toward my cabin. It sat against the rock wall of the canyon, the backside built into stone with a corral to one side and a stack of wood under tarp near the door. When she slid down from the saddle, her knees faltered, but held. Her eyes moved slow across the place, noting each corner like she was fixing a map in her head. Inside was plain, one bed, a table with 2 chairs, shelves of coffee and beans, a small stove with a pot hanging over it. I shut the door against the cold, took off my hat, and told her to sit. She did, careful and deliberate, her hands buried under the coat. From the water bucket, I filled a tin cup and gave it to her. The rope burns were dark and raw now in the lamplight. I fetched clean cloth and a bottle of whiskey from the box under the table. "This will sting," I said, soaking the rag before pressing it gently to her wrists. She flinched, but stayed still until both were cleaned and wrapped. Her eyes stayed on me, silent but heavy with questions. I set the bottle aside and spoke first. "I was running traps south of here. Heard the wolves. Figured something had them pinned." I met her gaze. "Didn't expect to find you?" She lowered her eyes before speaking. "You could have left me." Her voice was flat without challenge. "I could have," I said. "Didn't seem right." I moved to the stove, lighting it and setting a pot of beans to warm. When I slid a plate toward her, she ate slow, as if measuring each bite. I pulled a blanket from the shelf and set it by the bed. "You take this tonight. I'll take the floor." She studied my face for any sign of a price in my words, then said nothing more. I spread my coat near the door, leaned the rifle against the wall, and sat cleaning it by the lamplight, while she lay back under the blanket, eyes still on me. At first light, I stoked the fire. She was awake, watching from the bed. Over coffee, she spoke in short lines, her voice low. Her cousin Caleb Redbird had wanted her father's Springfield rifle after he died. When she refused, he told the others she had traded with men outside their band, a lie that stuck fast enough for some to believe and others not to care. They tied her to that post as punishment, leaving the wolves to finish what they started. If Caleb found out she was alive, she said he would try again before anyone could ask why he lied. I told her plain we'd see that he didn't get the chance. When I stepped outside to check the horse, the frost near the corral carried 2 fresh sets of hoof prints. They hadn't been there the day before. Whoever made them had ridden close enough to see the chimney smoke if they were looking. I didn't like it. Inside, she caught the change in my face. "Riders?" she asked. "2," I said. Didn't stop, but they passed close. She straightened, pulling the coat tighter. "If it's them," I nodded. "Then they know you're here now." I showed her where the water sat. The cartridges were kept, and how to work the bolt on the door if someone came while I was out. By midday, the frost was gone, and we worked side by side splitting wood. She handled the axe like she'd done her share before the even swing and quick reset of someone used to hard labor. Toward evening, I made a slow circle beyond the corral. No riders in sight, but the track still marked my thoughts. Inside, she had the stove hot and a pot of rabbit stew giving off a steady warmth. We ate without much talk until she set her spoon down. "Why were you really in the Badlands?" she asked. I told her habit. I went where it was quiet, where no one expected me. "Then why answer to me?" she pressed. I looked at her across the table. "Because leaving you there would have made me no better than the ones who tied you up." She didn't reply, but something in her gaze softened before she turned back to her stew. The next morning, the air was still the kind of quiet that carries warning. She sat at the table with the blanket over her shoulders while I laced my boots. "Something's wrong," she said. Maybe I told her. "Stay inside while I check." I saddled the horse and rode toward the ridge, keeping to low ground. 2 horses were tied near a small fire. Even from a distance, I could see the blue army coat on one man and the pale scar on the other's cheek. I circled wide and came back without being seen. When I pushed open the door, Naomi was standing just inside with a rifle in her hands. "They're here," I said. "Caleb's men. They're camped on the ridge." Her jaw tightened. "If they're here, he's close," maybe I said. "Or maybe he sent them to see if you're still breathing. Either way, you don't step outside without me." We went about the day as if it were any other, patching the roof edge, splitting another stack of wood. But each of us kept an ear tuned to the quiet beyond the walls. That night, the wind came up again, rattling the shutters. She finally asked what had been sitting between us. "Why help me?" "You don't know me." I set my spoon down. I've seen too many left to die because nobody wanted the trouble. I'm not doing that again. She held my eyes a long moment before speaking. "And if I bring trouble to your door," I didn't look away. "Then I deal with it." The lamplight threw a soft glow across the room. And for the first time since I'd cut her down from that post, I saw the line of her shoulders ease. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere it shouldn't be. I knew then the stillness wouldn't last. The wind had shifted overnight, pulling the smell of wood smoke from somewhere it didn't belong. I stepped out before first light, the air damp and cold enough to sink deep into the joints. That smoke wasn't from our chimney. The way it drifted told me it came from the south, near the ridge where no one had reason to camp. I saddled the horse without hurry, though every motion had purpose. Before mounting, I took the second rifle from the wall and set it on the table next to Naomi. "If someone comes through that door who isn't me, don't wait for them to talk," I told her. She held my eyes for a long second, then nodded. The ride toward the ridge was slow, keeping to the low washes. Through the sparse pines, I caught sight of two horses tied under a pinyon. Their riders crouched near a small fire, and even from that distance, I could see the blue army coat and the pale scar across one man's cheek. I kept low, circled wide, and came back without being seen. When I opened the cabin door, Naomi was still where I'd left her rifle in hand, watching the line of light under the door. "They're here," I said. "Caleb's men. They're camped by the ridge." Her jaw tightened. "If they're here, he's close, or he sent them to see if you're still breathing," I said, hanging my hat on the peg. "Either way, we don't give them the advantage." We worked through the morning as if it were any other day. She patched a split in the roof edge while I hauled another armload of wood inside. But every few minutes our eyes went to the windows. I showed her the low back door built into the cabin's rock wall, hidden by brush, and the way to pull the far shelves down to block the windows. She listened closely, committing each step to memory. When I handed her my knife and told her to show me how she used it, she moved without hesitation, short, quick strikes, no wasted motion. Someone had taught her well before now. By the time the sun was low, the wind was rattling the shutters. Inside, we ate without much talk. She was the one to break the quiet. "Why help me?" "You don't know me." I set my spoon down. "I've seen too many left to die because nobody wanted the trouble. I'm not doing that again." She studied my face. "And if I bring trouble to your door," I didn't look away. "Then I deal with it." The air between us shifted. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was closer than it had been. The next morning carried that same stillness I'd learned to trust as warning. As I split wood outside, movement on the horizon caught my eye, two riders moving slow, taking the low draws instead of the open trail. I went inside without a word that might carry. Naomi was braiding her hair at the table. She read my face before I spoke. "They're coming," I said. "Scarred cheek, army coat." "Exactly how you described." Her hand stilled. "If they see me, they'll send word to him. He'll come." I tossed her a blanket. "Go to the back crawl space. Stay low until I tell you." She started to argue. I can shoot, I know I said. But right now I need them thinking you're gone. She slipped out the back while I left the front door half open, leaning against the corral fence when the riders came in. The scarred man gave a tight smile. Heard you've been seen with a woman Apache, about ye-high black hair? I shrugged. Haven't had company in months. Might want to check your sources. The one in the army coat scanned the cabin. We know she was near the ridge. Didn't walk away on her own. My voice stayed even. You calling me a liar? They didn't answer, but the air was tight enough to snap. I let the silence work, then pushed off the fence. Whatever you've been told, you're not finding it here. Best turn around while the trail's still open. Scar's smile faded. We'll be back, maybe with more men. I kept my eyes steady. Bring whoever you want. Won't change the answer. They turned slow, making sure I saw they weren't in a hurry. I waited until they were a rise away before going inside. Naomi emerged from the crawl space, brushing dust from her dress. They'll tell him, she said. Probably, I answered. Which means we've got days, maybe less. She stood there holding my gaze. You could still tell me to leave. I could, I said, but I'm not going to. She nodded once. Then I'll fight with you when they come. The next 2 days carried an edge. My rifle stayed close no matter where I was across the saddle horn when I checked the far fence line leaning against my knee by the stove propped on the table when I ate. Naomi kept her hands busy mending one of my shirts and cutting the bolt of cloth I'd traded for, but her eyes flicked to the windows often. On the third morning, I saw the dust first, a low column rolling toward us across the flats. One rider in front, 2 behind with another pair spread wide. 5 in all, moving like a sweep, not a visit. The lead rider sat tall in the saddle, broad in the shoulders. Even from that distance, I knew it was Caleb. I stepped inside. They're here. Naomi didn't ask who. She pulled on her moccasins, picked up the rifle, and stood ready. I'm not hiding this time. I studied her a moment, then nodded. All right. But you stay behind me until I say otherwise. We stepped out together as the riders closed in. Caleb reined in 30 yards, out his gaze running from me to her. I see the wolves didn't finish what they started, he said. My voice was flat. They had better things to do. His eyes narrowed before settling on her. You've caused enough trouble. Come down from there and I'll forget the insult. Naomi stepped forward, rifle steady. You lied. You took my father's rifle and told them I sold myself to outsiders. I won't go anywhere with you. Caleb tilted his head. That rifle's mine now. Passed to me when you were cast out. That's not how she tells it, I said. And if you came for it, you're leaving without it. Scar shifted in his saddle, the man in the army coat sliding a hand toward his sidearm. Caleb's smile thinned. You'd stand for her knowing the trouble it'll bring. I'm already standing, I said. The moment held tight as wire until Caleb leaned forward. We'll be back, he said. And when we do, you'll wish you'd given her up. I didn't flinch. Bring more men if you want. Won't change how it ends. He turned his horse without another word, his men following. When the dust settled, Naomi's jaw was set, her hand steady on the rifle. They'll come at night, she said. Maybe, I answered. But now we know it's him. And now he knows we're ready. We didn't speak much after Caleb and his men rode off, but the sound of their threat lingered in the air like dust that wouldn't settle. Naomi set her rifle on the table, but her hand stayed close to it while we boarded the shutters and stacked wood inside. By the time the last light faded, the cabin felt smaller, the shadows deeper. I kept my rifle across my knees, cleaning it again, though it needed no more oil. She checked the Winchester I'd given her, sliding each round into place with a steady hand. While the stove gave off its low orange glow, She told me about her father's rifle, a Springfield he'd promised would be hers when she was old enough. Caleb had taken it the day after the burial, telling the others she wasn't fit to keep it. That's why I didn't just run when they tied me to that post, she said. I'd already tried once. They caught me. If I left without it again, I'd lose the last thing I had of him. I nodded once, letting the weight of that settle. It wasn't just about a rifle. Near midnight, I heard them before I saw anything hooves moving careful on frozen soil, trying not to carry. I motioned to the lamp and Naomi doused it, leaving only the dim light from the stove. We took positions, me at the front window, her covering the side. Shapes moved low against the moonlit flats, 5 riders spreading out, slipping in from different angles. A voice called from the dark calm, but carrying. Last chance to hand her over. No need for anyone to get hurt. My answer was loud enough to reach them. You've already done your hurting. Won't be any here tonight. The cousin's voice came back sharper. Then we take her. A shadow crossed the yard, and I fired the report, cracking through the cold. A man fell from his saddle. Naomi's shot came a heartbeat later, catching another and sending his horse bolting. Caleb stayed mounted in the dark, but his voice carried. You think you can shoot your way out? Not thinking, I said. Just doing. We traded 2 more shots, both clean, both pushing the remaining riders back toward the ridge. Caleb's silhouette lingered longer than the rest, before turning into the dark. We stood still until the sound of hooves was gone. Naomi lowered her rifle, breathing hard but steady. They'll be back, she said. Not tonight, I answered, closing the shutters. Next time they'll know we're not the easy mark they thought. She looked at me for a long moment before speaking. You didn't have to fight for me. I met her gaze. Yeah, I did. For the first time since I'd cut her down, she let a small, tired smile slip through. The morning after the fight, the ground outside told the story. Plain hoofprints gouged into the dirt patches churned where men had fallen, a trail breaking south toward the low draws. I followed it with my eyes, knowing Caleb wouldn't stop after one try. Inside, Naomi was already at the table cleaning her rifle with a focus that told me she'd been awake for hours. You're going after them, she said. Not we. I told her. Me. Her jaw set. You think I'm going to wait here to see if you come back? There wasn't much to argue. If Caleb saw her standing against him with that rifle, it would end in a way I couldn't alone. We rode out just after sunrise, following the south trail. The wind was sharp, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke. Within the hour, we spotted a camp pressed against a rock wall. 3 horses tied nearby, 2 men warming their hands, and the third sitting apart with the Springfield across his lap. Naomi's breath caught. That's his, she said. We get the rifle, we end this, I told her. We dismounted 100 yards out, moving through the rocks. At 30 yards, I stepped into the open with my rifle raised, set the rifle down, and stepped away from the fire. Caleb looked up, surprise flickering, before his face settled into something harder. You should have stayed in your cabin, he said. Maybe, I replied. But I don't wait for trouble to knock twice. Naomi stepped from behind the rocks, her own rifle leveled. The rifle, she said. Caleb's laugh was short. You think you can take it from me? Her voice didn't waver. I don't think. I know. Something in her tone made him pause. He set the Springfield down, slow, stepping back. His men shifted, but one look from my rifle kept them still. Naomi picked up the rifle, checked the chamber, and slung it over her shoulder. My father's, she said, her voice even. I kept my eyes on Caleb. You come within 10 miles of that cabin again, you won't ride away. Caleb's jaw tightened. You've made your choice, he told her. Don't expect to come back. She shook her head. I'm not coming back. I have a home now. We backed away, rifles up until they were mounted and riding in the opposite direction. The ride home was quiet, but the weight between us had shifted. The Springfield rested across her lap like something alive. By the time the canyon wall came into view, the sun was low and the air sharp with evening. We stabled the horse, brought the wood in, and lit the stove. Naomi leaned the rifle in the corner by the bed, her voice steady when she spoke. "I'm staying. Not because I owe you, but because I want to." I looked at her a long moment and said, "Then we'll make this place ours." The ridge was quiet that night, the wolves a distant sound under the stars. But quiet never holds long out here, and I had a feeling the next knock on the door wouldn't be from Caleb. The day after we brought the Springfield home, the air settled into a tense quiet. Naomi kept to small tasks inside, cutting the cloth I'd traded for and setting stitches on an old shirt of mine. I spent most of the day outside checking the far fence line, hauling more wood under the overhang by the door. We spoke little, but it wasn't from any distance between us, more from each of us, listening for what might come. Near sundown, I made a slow walk past the corral, eyes sweeping the horizon. No movement, no dust trails, just the long stretch of flats fading into shadow. Inside, Naomi had the stove hot and stew simmering. She ladled it out without a word, and we ate in the quiet rhythm we'd found since that night fight. The only sound beyond the clink of tin spoons was the faint whistle of wind along the rock wall. After supper, she set the bowls aside and reached for the rifle she'd leaned near the bed. "If they come again," she said, "we don't wait for them to circle the place." I met her gaze and nodded. "Next time, we decide the ground." That seemed to settle something for her, and she turned back to her stitching with steady hands. The following morning carried a brittle chill, the kind that stiffens leather and makes the boards of the cabin creak underfoot. We rode out early, partly to scout, partly to keep from feeling boxed in. The land was pale under frost sagebrush edges tipped white. We kept a wide loop south, crossing the dry creek bed and skirting the low ridges. Tracks showed where a small band of horses had passed within the week, but the trail broke west before coming too close to our place. By midday, we stopped at a narrow rise where you could see the open stretch for miles. Naomi sat her horse easy, the Springfield resting across her lap. "Feels different out here," she said, scanning the flats. Like they could be anywhere, but not close enough to see. I knew what she meant. The quiet wasn't always comfort. It could just mean someone was taking their time. We reached the trading post by late afternoon. I traded for coffee salt lamp oil and a sack of flour. Naomi walked the short aisle of goods, the storekeeper's eyes following her more than they should have. She ignored it, asking only for a small packet of needles and thread. On the ride back, she kept her head up and her eyes forward, the Springfield angled across her saddle in plain view. That night, as we brought the wood in, I noticed the change in the wind. It carried a thin edge of smoke again, faint but not from our chimney. From the west this time, I told her. She closed the door behind me and slid the bolt without my asking. We kept the lamps low and the shutters closed. Before bed, I moved the spare rifle closer to the table where either of us could reach it in a breath. The next 2 days passed without sign, but the stillness held. Naomi worked outside with me, more splitting wood and checking the roofline for loose boards. At one point, she stopped to watch the sky where the ridge cut against the pale afternoon. "They'll come when the ground works for them," she said quietly. I didn't answer, because we both knew she was right. On the third morning, I saddled the horse early and asked if she wanted to ride with me to check the canyon mouth. She slung the Springfield over her shoulder without hesitation. The frost crunched under the hooves as we moved out, breath from the horse rising like smoke in the cold. The canyon mouth was empty, the ground undisturbed, but I dismounted to study the edges. A few fresh boot prints showed where someone had been standing, just inside the shadow of the wall, watching the approach, then leaving without coming closer. We followed those prints until they disappeared into rocky ground where sign wouldn't hold. Naomi stood next to me, scanning the distance. Could have been anyone, she said, though her tone made it clear she didn't believe that. I shook my head. Not anyone. They came to see if we were here. We didn't linger. Back at the cabin, the stove was lit, the smell of coffee carrying into the room. We sat across from each other at the table. If they mean to push us, she said, we take the fight before they set the time. I leaned forward. Then we start watching the places they'll pass through to get here. By late afternoon, we had a plan. Each day we'd ride in opposite directions for a short stretch, doubling back to meet at the cabin before dusk. That way, no one could come close without one of us seeing sign. The first evening of that plan, I returned to find Naomi already inside, a small pile of spent shells on the table beside her. She glanced up. Crows on the ridge scattered fast, like something big passed through. No riders, but I stayed put to see if they circled. We ate by lamplight again, each of us listening more to the quiet than to our own thoughts. When the wind picked up after dark, it carried that same unsettled feeling as the night before the first fight. I set the rifle on the chair beside me instead of the wall. Naomi reached for the Springfield without a word. Neither of us said it, but we were thinking the same thing. The ground between quiet and trouble had gotten thin. By the fourth day of our watch, the stillness had started to weigh heavier than the cold. We kept to our plan, one of us riding out in the morning, the other circling in the afternoon, meeting at the cabin before dusk. That afternoon, Naomi returned first, the Springfield resting across her lap as she stepped down from the saddle. Saw dust east of the ridge, she said. Could be wind, but it moved too even. I led the horse to the corral, glancing toward the horizon. The air carried no sound, no sign, but I'd learned long ago not to trust a quiet that deep. We kept the lamps low that night, shutters barred the rifles within arm's reach. After the plates were cleared, Naomi sat on the edge of the bed cleaning the Springfield, again the oilcloth dark where she'd worked it into the stock. I moved to the window now and then, checking the line of the ridge under a thin moon. The wind picked up around midnight, whistling against the eaves. I heard it then, a faint metallic clink, not the sound of branches or loose boards. I crossed the room, met Naomi's eyes, and nodded once. We took our positions without speaking. I eased the front shutter open just enough to see the yard. A shadow moved between the corral and the cabin wall, keeping low. Naomi shifted to cover the side, her silhouette steady against the dim glow from the stove. Another figure appeared beyond the first, and then a third shapes breaking away to flank us. This wasn't Caleb's style of talk first. This was meant to be quiet work. The first man came close enough that I could see the frost on his coat. I fired once, the shot echoing hard off the rock wall. He dropped before he could raise his weapon. Naomi's shot followed from the side window, catching the second before he reached cover. The third shadow froze, then broke for the yard. I cycled another round and sent it into the dirt at his feet. He stumbled back, retreating into the dark. Silence followed, broken only by the wind and the groan of the shutters settling. We waited a full 10 minutes before closing the windows and setting the bar on the door. Naomi exhaled, slow, setting the rifle on the table. "They're testing," she said. I nodded. "Next time they won't stop at the edge." Morning light showed fresh tracks cut deep into the frozen dirt, leading off toward the southern draws. We followed them on horseback until the trail split, one set curving west, the other south. At the fork, Naomi pulled up, scanning the distance. "The south trail's cleaner," she said. "Easier to ride fast if they're leading someone back." We kept to that line for nearly 2 miles before losing it in rocky ground. Back at the cabin, the air inside felt close. Naomi set coffee on the stove while I moved the extra cartridges to a shelf just above the table, where either of us could reach them in a hurry. She sat, her hands wrapped around the tin cup. If they mean to push us, she said, we can't just sit here waiting for the knock. I leaned forward. Then, we take the ground before they do. We spent the afternoon marking out sight lines from the ridge to the flats, noting where the sage grew thick enough to hide a rider. I set a pair of fence posts as markers along the west side, giving us a quick measure for range if they came from that direction. Naomi checked the low brush near the back door, clearing anything that could slow a retreat into the canyon if we needed it. By sundown, the place was as ready as we could make it. We ate quick, the light already fading, and sat near the stove with rifles close. Naomi looked toward the window, her eyes narrowed. It won't be long now. Outside, the wind had stilled completely, leaving the kind of hollow quiet that lets every sound travel for miles. I listened for the change, knowing it would come sudden. It did. A faint drumming carried from the west, slow but steady, growing sharper as it closed the distance. Naomi stood lifting the Springfield. I moved to the window. Through the dim light, I saw them 4 riders in a staggered line, moving at a measured pace. The lead man sat taller than the rest, coat collar turned up against the cold. Even from here, I recognized Caleb's frame. "They're coming to talk," I said, though my voice held no expectation of peace. Naomi's grip on the rifle didn't ease. "Then let's hear what he thinks he's got to say." We stayed where we were until the horses closed within 50 yards, then stepped out together, the cold air biting through our coats. Caleb reined in his gaze, moving from me to Naomi. "You've made your choice clear," he said. "This is mine. You leave now, or I see to it you don't get the chance later." I kept my eyes steady. "We're not leaving." His jaw tightened. "Then you've just written the end of this yourself." He turned his horse without another word, his men following. Naomi watched them go until they dipped out of sight beyond the ridge. "Next time won't be a warning," she said. I nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in my chest. The day after Caleb's warning, we moved with the quiet purpose of people who knew time was short. Naomi checked the rifles twice before noon, laying the cartridges in neat rows along the table edge. I worked the back wall, clearing the brush enough so we'd have an open path into the canyon if we needed it. The light stayed thin all day, a gray cover hanging over the flats, muting the colors until everything felt drawn in close. By evening, the stillness had settled so deep, the crackle from the stove seemed too loud. We ate without talk, both of us listening more to the silence outside than to the sound of our spoons. When we finished, I set my bowl aside and moved to the front window, easing the shutter open just enough to see the yard. No movement, no sound, just the low shape of the corral and the darker line of the ridge beyond. Sometime near midnight, the wind came back in sharp bursts, rattling the roof. I'd been sitting with my rifle across my knees when I caught it, hoofbeats faint, but too even to be wild. I met Naomi's eyes across the room, and we moved without a word. She crossed to the side window, lifting the Springfield into position. I stayed at the front. The shapes emerged slow from the dark 5 riders again, but spread wider this time. Caleb was in the center, holding his horse just at the edge of the yard. His voice carried clear in the cold. "Last chance to walk away." I let the words hang, then answered, "Not leaving." There was no back and forth after that. One of his men broke forward on foot, moving fast toward the front. I fired once, dropping him before he cleared the open space. From the side, Naomi's shot cracked, sending another man reeling back. The rest scattered for cover, flashes from their pistols sparking against the dark. I worked the lever, sending a round into the yard, forcing one rider to break and run. Naomi kept the side covered, every shot deliberate. Caleb stayed in the saddle, firing once, before turning his horse toward the ridge. Within moments they were gone, the sound of hooves fading into the wind. We held our positions until the cold bit through the stillness again. Inside, Naomi lowered her rifle and set it on the table. "They won't come that way again," she said. "No," I agreed, "next time will be harder." We set the rifles close before turning in, knowing the night was far from safe. At first light, I walked the yard, noting the churned dirt where they'd fallen back and the trail they'd cut toward the ridge. We followed on horseback until the ground turned to rock, losing the sign in the high flats. Naomi reined in beside me, scanning the distance. "They'll pull back far enough to think we'll let down our guard," she said. I glanced her way. Then we don't. The next days were a slow grind of keeping ready. We repaired a section of the corral that had been left open, stacked the last of the winter wood inside, and kept the lamps trimmed but low after dark. Naomi worked with her rifle each evening, checking the sights, reloading until it was second nature. I set extra water and cartridges within easy reach of both doors. On the fourth night, the wind dropped again, and the air felt heavy like a storm building without clouds. Naomi was at the table sewing a tear in her coat when I heard it, one sharp clink of metal far off, but carried clean through the stillness. I stood listening. The second sound came lower, a shift of weight in the dirt, the kind that meant someone was out there waiting. We didn't move fast. We didn't need to. Rifles were in our hands before the next breath. Naomi nodded toward the back. I slipped through the low door into the brush circling the cabin until I reached the shadow of the corral. A lone figure stood at the edge of the yard, just beyond the line where the frost turned to dirt. His hat was pulled low, but the build was Caleb's. He didn't call out this time, just turned and walked back toward the ridge. It was a message, plain as words. He was close, and he could come as near as he liked. When I stepped back inside, Naomi was standing by the front door, her coat pulled on Mount, Springfield in hand. "We need to end this," she said. I met her eyes. "Tomorrow?" Dawn came cold and still, the kind of morning where every sound carries far. Naomi and I saddled up before the sun cleared the ridge, our breath hanging white in the air. The plan was simple, ended before Caleb found the courage to try again. We rode the long way around, keeping to the low draws and sage until we reached the rocky rise above the canyon. From there we saw them, 3 men, left Caleb among them, camped near a dead cottonwood. Their horses were tied loose, a thin line of smoke curling from the fire. Naomi's eyes met mine. No words passed. We eased down the slope, rifles ready. When Caleb spotted us, his hand went to his belt, but I was already calling out. "It's over, Caleb. You walk away now, or you don't walk at all." He looked from me to Naomi, maybe searching for some give, but she didn't offer any. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "You sold me once. You won't take my life on top of it." The quiet that followed was heavier than the cold. One of his men dropped his gun and backed away without a word. The other hesitated, then followed. Caleb stood alone, jaw tight, before tossing his revolver into the dirt. I kept him covered while Naomi stepped closer, picking it up and slipping it into her coat. "Go," she told him, "and don't ride this way again." We watched him mount and head toward the flats, his figure shrinking against the pale sky. Only when he was a speck on the horizon did we turn back toward home. The ride felt longer, the weight of the past weeks settling into something quieter. Back at the cabin, the fire took hold, quick filling the room with that dry, comforting heat. Naomi set her rifle in its place by the door. "It's ours now," she said. I nodded, knowing she didn't mean the cabin alone. She meant the peace to live without looking over her shoulder. The days that followed were slow in the best way. We mended fences, restocked wood, and learned each other's silences. The winter wind still rattled the shutters at night, but it was just wind now. The kind that carries no threat, only the promise of another day. If there's a thing I'll remember most, it's that a person can be left for dead and still stand taller than those who tried to break them. Out here, family isn't always blood. It's who rides beside you when trouble comes. If you've listened this far, maybe you've known a fight worth standing for. Maybe you found your own kind of family in the unlikeliest place. Hold on to it. Out here, that's worth more than gold.